Juniper Books presents The Luckiest Man in the World by Molly Cutpurse, narrated by John Crabtree PhD from his notes recorded at the time. Chapter 14.
27th of March, 2026. Only when the new day arrived did I witness under what dreadful conditions these people lived, or rather survived. And yet, they were surprisingly cheerful. I wouldn't say happy and content, but they certainly didn't strike me as being hard done by. In fact, some of them had been homeless for so long that their personalities were brighter and more positive than many people that I'd known that had everything they wanted. I wondered if that was because they were not constantly dominated by greed. Perhaps being free from that offered them a kind of peace in compensation. The best part, though, was that not a soul recognized me. Very early on, a Salvation Army van arrived. It was then that one not very tall man, around about 40 years of age, and guessing that I was new, showed me how to get a coffee and a filled roll from them. As I waited in line, and then as I was served, once again I was surprised that neither of the two ladies running the mobile soup kitchen recognised me. Perhaps all homeless people looked the same to them. Perhaps we were the faceless thousands. I didn't know, and began not to care, as me and my new acquaintance returned to his makeshift tent made from black plastic bags. And after we had finished eating, he even offered me a roll-up cigarette, which I politely declined. We spent the time with him of educating me in the best way to organise the day, which was normally spent in procuring free food, and by the fluidity of his knowledge knew all the restaurants where kitchens threw out the best food. Therefore, he clearly had been at this lark for a long time, and it was only his presence that delayed me from moving on. I mean, if he did recognise me, he was an expert at disguising it. It turned out to be a reasonably fine, sunny day, and after managing to get 4 cold slices of some rich person's pizza that they didn't want, we settled again with our backs to the wall of the church, our hunger relatively satisfied, the sun warming my face. It wasn't long before I looked at my companion, and he seemed content, as he too was enjoying the warmth of the sun. But despite what I have described, he really was a wreck of a man. His greying hair and skin was filthy, and I wondered why I couldn't smell any body odour. Perhaps he had gone beyond that stage. His clothes matched the rest of him, for all he had on was dirty and ragged jeans and a torn puffer jacket. The cleanest part of him was his trainers, which looked almost new. No doubt he had procured them from somehow. It was my innate curiosity that asked me what was his name, and he said Harry Parson. How long had you been holed up here, Harry? At this place? Since last December, just before Christmas. The Sally Ann do a decent meal then. You don't want for anything, and there's always a bottle or two of wine about. A lot of do-gooders in this area. And have you been doing this a long time then? What, on the road? Yeah, I suppose so. 7 years. I was an engineer, and I fell through the cracks. What exactly does that mean? It means I was once gainfully employed, and then I wasn't. Lost my wife, my kid, my home, just about everything. I didn't have the strength to pull myself up. What sort of an engineer? Mechanical. Good job it was too. Can I ask what happened? You can, but only if you tell me why a multi-millionaire like you prefers to doss down here with these unmentionables. I fully admit he caught me off guard. Don't look so surprised. I recognised you straight away, and your clothes don't exactly look as if you are down and out. I don't get it then. Why haven't you turned me in? And from what I understand, the newspapers are paying a fortune for information about me. Money's not everything, John. I had money once, and look how I've turned out. In fact, by having no money, and in fact by not owning anything, all that's rendered me is that I'm freer than I ever was. I learned that lesson the hard way, but it was a good lesson, even profound. You mean you once had a life like those out there? I told you. I had a home, a wife, and a child. A decent job, company car, expense account, private health care. So you could say I was at the top of my game. And then you lost it all. Harry opened his eyes and stared at the path in front of us, and I could see his happy demeanour drop. Enough for me to apologise for being too inquisitive. Yeah, I lost it. Worst week of my life. I was 34 and riding high, almost without a care in the world. But I guess him upstairs had other reasons for taking me down. God? I guess. Or maybe it was the devil. Doesn't matter. What happened, happened. What did? Well, it was late on a Friday afternoon, and I guess I was driving home from Hastings when I was working on a bridge when my phone rang. I see the call was from an unknown number, but I answered it anyway, only to hear a man's voice asking if I was Mr. Parson. When I affirmed that I was, for some reason the connection was lost, and I didn't give it any more thought, thinking that it was a nuisance call. But when I got home, there was a police car waiting in the street, and 2 coppers approached me when I got out of my car. I actually didn't need them to tell me that my wife and child had died in a car accident. I could read their faces. Shit. Yep, it was. Somehow I got through the double funeral 10 days later, and once that was over, then that's when I began to fall apart. So, the job went, and then the house, because the mortgage weren't being paid. Debt collectors took what they wanted to pay off my creditors. And then, one day I found myself on the street in Croydon with 1 suitcase, 1 change of clothes and a toothbrush. That was 5 years ago. Depression followed, and I was treated in a clinic for a month, but I eventually discharged myself, and so here I am. Probably more content than I was when I was earning 75k a year. That's the most dreadful story I ever heard. I'm really sorry, Harry. Well, that's me. Now you. Okay. God, like you, it's a story. I've got nothing to do, John. Let it rip. I suppose it took me a best part of an hour to describe what happened to me, from the moment I saw that light in the sky to huddling under the shadow of the most famous Spitalfields church, and I left nothing out, including the times I had acted out in a not-so-chivalrous way, and Harry listened intently, not interrupting at all until I fell silent. So this woman reporter lives around here? Yeah, just a little north up Commercial Street. So you left in the middle of the night. So where are you going to now? My plan is to go back to where I first saw that light. To do what? I don't know. I probably won't even get there. Someone will recognise me and start a disturbance, and then I'll be taken in for my own protection, I suppose. After that, well, I haven't ruled out taking my own life. That's crazy, man. You shouldn't do that. Can I see the tats? I took off my glove and discreetly showed it to him. So how does it work? I mean, if it works. As an engineer, I can't see how... That's what everybody says. I don't know how it works. As a mathematician, I can't even come up with a theory. I look at them, and I feel like Isaac Newton might feel, as if he were given an iPad, or like putting Dickens in a major film set and asking him to guess what does he think everybody was doing. Because given his level of knowledge, there's just no way on earth he would ever be able to figure out what everybody was doing or what was happening. And so this is the same. Nobody can figure out how it manages to do what it does. Do you fancy giving me a demonstration? Not here, I won't. But I suppose I could take you somewhere. I already know where this is going. My wife, Suzanne, told me that morning that Katie, our girl, was due for her shots at the clinic, and she said that the appointment was for 2:00. I was driving there Harry stopped talking, and I witnessed his pain as he fought to control his emotions. He breathed heavily through his nose, and his expression changed dramatically as his eyes began to glisten. With difficulty, he swallowed several times. You don't have to tell me, Harry. No, I will. It happened at the crossroads at Island Tower. An ex-policeman who happened to be there gave evidence at the coroner's. A woman jumped the lights, going at speed, and sideswiped Suzanne's car, which was then spun 180 degrees into the path of an oncoming lorry. Both died instantly. The woman only suffered a broken leg, and later she got 8 years for manslaughter. She wasn't drunk, but she was stuffed full of heroin. Harry, I'm guessing that you remember the exact date this happened. I do. You proposing to do the impossible? Harry, I know I can't do much about my own sorry state of affairs, but I can do something about yours. You can stop her driving to that clinic. Harry gave a kind of choked chuckle, which I thought was odd. It's a lovely thought, John. I only wish it were true, but I don't care about what the newspapers have said about you, because the fact is that going back in time is impossible, and I'm coming from an engineer's point of view. If you believe that, then you have to say that everything that I've told you about myself has been a lie. Do you think I've been lying to you? I don't think you can imagine how many times I've wished that I hadn't gone to work that morning, knowing what I know. Bloody hundreds, and all of it a waste of brain power, wishing for something that I can't change. How old would your girl be now, in this year? Coming up for her 8th birthday. Then let me make that happen. Allow me. You're serious, aren't you? But I do wonder why all those professionals believe you can actually do it. Is it true about that singer then? Her too? Every word, Harry. I can take you back there, and you can alter events. Allow them to live again. It's mad. Yes, it is. Completely. But nonetheless, I can do it. Even now, I do not know why Providence caused me to sit by this man, but in realizing that I could help him, I knew that didn't matter. In that moment, nothing else matters. I felt I had a job to do, and that was all that was important. I was here to heal this man's soul. It was the most important job in the world, the only job in the world, and compared to it, my problems were nothing. How and why I felt like, at the time, again, I had no idea. However, for all my waxing about duty and the healing of souls of human beings, an issue that a year previously I would not have entertained at all, it still meant that I had to travel to the time and place of the incident that ended the life of Harry's wife. and with the possibility of every person in London, if not actively searching for me. Certainly by this time they had a picture of my ugly face in their consciousness. Hence the need for circumspection. And the very best way to avoid all that was to travel to Croydon in an earlier time. Yet, for all my internal enthusiasm, Harry remained seated, even after I had stood. Harry, no time like the present, if you'll excuse the pun. I could see the doubt written large across his face, and I could also see the internal battle that was becoming larger and more noticeable with every passing second. Harry, should we go? The thing is, I don't fancy walking to Croydon. Who said anything about walking? We'll get a train. Something I ought to have thought of for me. With what? Remember who I am. I have money. And what about being recognised? Why don't you leave that to me? I'm going to make sure I won't be. Come on, Harry. You want your life back, don't you? As if to emphasise the point, I held out my hand again, and his eyes travelled down where he focused on the marks. I asked him again, Harry? It was easy enough to walk around the rear of the church, where we found ourselves alone, and Harry, now with even more doubt showing, watched me enter the date of 2 months previously, and then looked at my hand as I grasped his arm. Our eyes met. You'll notice the change in light levels, but don't worry about it. Just close your eyes and relax. It happens instantaneously. Without waiting for him to say anything, I touched the 9th mark, and the fabric of time warped and was accompanied by the usual staccato changes in light. Harry was startled, but at least I was expecting that. What I wasn't expecting was that we had arrived during a heavy bout of fine, cold, misty rain. It was the type that seeps so thoroughly into clothes. However, more than anything else, it convinced Harry that something incredible had happened, and he appeared speechless, partly, I believe, from what he was experiencing, but mostly because of a growing feeling that what I had promised was actually going to happen. In his excitement, he took hold of me and silently gave me a bear hug, which, if I'm honest, lasted a little too long because I wasn't exactly a person who enjoyed physical contact with strangers. But undoubtedly, Harry was a hugging type of person. What happened? Where? When are we? Relax, Harry. All I've done is go back 2 months so we can travel to Croydon without me getting recognised. Come on. We have to get to the station. Once we were on the final overland train, it only took about 40 minutes before we reached East Croydon. Under Harry's direction, we immediately began to walk towards West Croydon and Oakfield Road, where his house was situated. As we walked, I noticed a look of frenzy on Harry's face. His expression was as if he was filled with ice. Harry, you understand what's happening, don't you? We've only gone back 2 months, just for my benefit. Yeah, I get it. All the same, for me, it was wonderful to walk along an ordinary street and for people to pay no attention to me whatsoever. The same could not be said for Harry, though, as his tramp-like appearance drew some attention. As we neared our destination, I tugged on his arm. Harry, this would be a good time to go back properly now. You understand, to the date. He nodded furiously and stopped walking. What happens now then? I saw one of those narrow pathways that often exist between row of houses and tugged on his arm. In here. Come on, that will do. The alleyway was narrow, but it wasn't overlooked, and it didn't take me long to touch the date he gave me. Without hesitation, except to look in either direction, I took us back, and the world we entered was almost uncannily silent. "Harry, we're here. Harry, Harry, your wife and child are alive here. Are you okay?" "Here? We're here?" I saw his lower lip was trembling, and for the first time doubt crept over me, and I wondered if he was up to the task of doing what we had planned. "Harry, are you okay?" He nodded, but I was not at all convinced. What we had originally planned was to somehow stall Mrs. Parsons' car before she reached the junction, but now, just going on the appearance of her husband, I had some doubts. Therefore, it was time to do something else less drastic. I looked at the clock on my mobile and was relieved when I saw that we had plenty of time before she even left the house. However, by now, Harry was almost entirely useless, the complete opposite of the famous singer whose name about whom I am being intentionally vague. Later, I would ponder heavily about personality and gender as one adapted so readily, while another had not. "Come on, we'll go to your house. We'll do it there." Another 10 minutes walking with Harry guiding me took us to Oakfield Road, and I saw by Google Maps, and confirmed by Harry, that his wife would take the southern route, out of the street. So that's where we waited, on the corner, keeping a permanent eye on the car that we could see in the drive. Being there and seeing his car seemed to jog Harry back to the present, but all he was able to talk about was that he could see his car. He seemed utterly mesmerised by it somehow, I think, realising that his dead wife and child were not somehow actually dead. I remember seeing him physically trembling and swallowing continuously. I checked the time. Minutes to go. And I told him to go and stand just round the corner and warned him to stay there despite whatever might happen. To my relief, he obeyed this instruction, and I was able to concentrate on the car as I puffed almost continuously on my vapour pipe. Then, in the quietness of the street, I saw Mrs. Parson lead out a little girl in a white dress and place her in the back seat, apparently in a child's seat, before she returned to the house momentarily. Then she got in the car herself, and I heard the engine and then watched as she backed it out of the driveway. I took one final glance at Harry, and he looked like a man on the edge of a precipice. But with one hand behind me, I managed to give him a thumbs up as the car now slowly began to advance towards me. 100 metres, 70 metres, 50 metres. Only then did I step into the road, and in a direct line in front of her, stopped and turned. Of course, she slowed, and somehow, in the middle of my anxiety, my brain managed to take in 100 details of speed, direction, age of car, and so many other parameters that I was unconscious of before it spat out a length of time that would be required for her to avoid that tragic accident. In a single mesmerising moment, I realised that heroin addict might well cause the death of some other innocent bystander, but I was not there for whomever that might be. Perhaps it might be just one person, or perhaps a family of 6. Perhaps she might plough into pedestrians. Who knew what was going to happen during the next half hour? Of course, in a perfect world, it would have been better all round if I had traced that woman back to when she first got into the car and perhaps taken her keys. I knew that, and realised 100 other things as Mrs. Parsons' car slowed and I saw her annoyed look as she stared straight at me, finally coming to a halt 3 or 4 metres away. I saw her lift up both hands as if to indicate, "What the hell?" But I was counting, you see, counting the seconds because my brain had spat out the number 60. 60 seconds was all it would be to to delay her, and as I walked slowly towards her, keeping myself in line with the bonnet of the car, I saw her expression change into concern and saw her quickly lock the doors. In the quietness of the street, I heard the characteristic clicking noises they made. In my own defence, I showed her the palms of my hands as I held them up until I reached the bonnet and lowered them, placing them on the cold paintwork. From inside the car, I heard her muffled exclamation, "What do you want?" I was still counting. I never answered, but just continued to stare at her. "I'm going to call the police." And still I counted as I saw her scramble for her mobile in her handbag, then pressing a button 3 times before holding it up to her face, her expression now one of anger as well as fear. I reached 60 and took a deep breath before turning and walked back to the pavement as her car rapidly moved out of her road, turning left at the small junction. Should I have counted to perhaps 120? Maybe, but I'm sure 60 was enough. For when I turned round to Harry, there was nobody there. And because he had been standing next to the end part of a house, there had been nowhere for him to hide either. That he might have darted off somewhere was impossible, and I stood, unable to comprehend where he had disappeared to. But apart from that, my concentration was about being apprehended by whomever Mrs. Parsons had called. Had she got through? Was anybody, even as I stood there, racing to apprehend the nutter who had threatened her? So even though I had the means to go where no policeman would ever apprehend me, I simply walked quickly away from where I eventually came to West Croydon Station, safe at last. Only then did I hear the faint siren of an emergency vehicle some way off. Was it in response to a 999 call? I never found out. Close by the station, I saw a coffee shop and gratefully entered it, pleased to smell the aroma of fresh coffee. I ordered a large latte and took a seat next to the window where I began to enjoy the sights and sounds of 2018. A time so much simpler than my own, particularly after what we have had to put up with for 2 years later. After finishing my coffee, I readily brought another and something sweet to eat. It was only after I had finished them and my belly was full of sweet, sugary goodness and caffeine that my current plight came nudging up against my consciousness again. I had limited money here. I was homeless and I was alone. Just because my family was here, that meant nothing. How could I go there, at least to speak to Maggie and Zoe when I was there myself? In a fraction of a second I had the thought of perhaps somewhere in London there was yet another me from my own future, enjoying coffee in a cafe, thinking of me sitting in a cafe in 2018. But I had the feeling this give me was so weird that I shook my head and tried instantly to put it out of my mind. This stuff could drive a man crazy. We weren't built for this sort of cogitation. Our brains weren't designed for it. It was designed for logical inferences where one event naturally flowed from one to another in a proper order. Not as I was thinking, for God's sake. In that moment I saw the stupidity of me even attempting to try and live in another time period such as the 1930s. The whole idea was just bloody ridiculous. But this left me with what? What decisions could I make now that would be in my best interests? And then an event happened that was perhaps 1 in a million, or perhaps it was the universe telling me that there was always an answer. Or perhaps it was just coincidence. As there was no way I could do an A-B test, my logical mind came down in favour of the latter, as I watched 2 young women enter the shop and began to queue. But these were no ordinary women, for they were identical twins, about 17 years old, They wore absolutely identical outfits of dark and expensive-looking trainers, yoga pants of bright blue, and bright red sports jackets. And with their blonde hair, styled exactly the same, they were some arresting sight. I certainly was not the only man in there who found them arresting. But, as attractive as they were, they conjured up for me a future without the ability of time travel, because connecting these women with what had taken place not an hour ago, I realised that the best thing I could do for myself would be to return to that place and time when that bright light did whatever it did. In other words, I could prevent myself from ever having that experience. If I could do it with Mrs. Parsons, then what's to stop me doing it for myself? As my eyes were kept glued on those twins as they queued, I came to the conclusion, nothing at all. I'd just continue with the idea I had when I left Jennifer's house. And this would solve every one of my problems. I wouldn't be a multimillionaire anymore. But what peace of mind I could finally achieve. I could be normal again and stop walking about as if I were some kind of ghost, unable to participate in normal and everyday affairs. Because that's how I felt. A man consisting of hardly any substance at all. A rite, an apparition, a phantasm, not of this world, but yet entirely in it. You must believe me when I write, that is not a normal feeling. Not when I compared myself to the happy and normal people who sat in that coffee house smiling and chatting with each other. Yes, I could easily have been a ghost, and I'm sure nobody would have even noticed me when I left. It's stupid, I know, but all the while I was there, I had the feeling that any moment I was going to be recognised. But then I had to continually remind myself that I was in 2018, not 2026. And it was refreshing. When I finally left the cafe, and after taking money from a hole-in-the-wall machine, I began the journey back to Snaresbrook almost without emotion, except for some deep, unrecognisable fear, which refused to dissipate. Snaresbrook on the 27th of March 2026 was, of course, exactly as I remembered it. The shops were familiar, the style of those that lived there felt comfortable, and the entire high street felt friendly and neighbourly. It wasn't such a bad place to grow up. It's just a shame that I was stuck with a father who cared more about what people thought of him than he did for his children. Although my father's early years were spent in the slums of Glasgow, to his credit, he had managed to claw his way out to make a better life for himself. The thing was that he expected his own children to fight the way he had, and that wasn't easy because our childhood was not spent in fighting poverty. I deliberately avoided my house. I chose another road, and therefore headed towards my favourite open space next to Eagle Pond, as I had done so many times previously. I found my old favourite oak tree easily enough among the elms, and unseen by anybody, sat at its base, and facing the same direction as I had done, looked upwards towards the clear sky, its western part blazing in red and gold. I felt it was time I confronted this, so moving to one side, simply as a precaution, I tapped the markings and murmured a goodbye to 2018, touched the final mark. And nothing appeared to happen. The weather was the same. The sky was still beautiful, and I was still alone. Yes, I had entered the right date, the 6th of January. This was the correct day as far as I remember. So where was the former John Crabtree, who ought to be sitting under that tree, doing his best to work out the Tate conjecture? I looked at the time on my watch, but as I had discovered a while ago, that had become the most useless piece of engineering I had ever purchased, because basically its mechanism when it was designed, was not able to take into account that its owner had the ability to transverse the centuries. But I was so used to looking at it that it just became automatic. I will say one thing, though, that would have amused me far more had I not felt myself to be in such a perilous position. And that was, I enjoyed watching its tiny computerized clock face as it attempted to remedy its present time by synchronizing with the internet. Sometimes it appeared to go backwards before reversing itself. Watching it was like seeing something undergoing a brainstorm. Of course, I knew what that was like. I stood. So, there I was, and stood still long enough for the stars to appear. I recognised Mercury and Venus in the west, and Jupiter and Saturn still reasonably close together, and slowly I saw my old friend, the constellation of Cassiopeia. But although I searched the sky and waited, I never saw any strange light, nor any strange me either. I must have waited on that spot for perhaps 2 hours, at least until it was quite dark, and the stars glittered like diamonds shining among a sheet of black velvet. But poetry aside, just where the hell was I? And why was I expecting to happen hadn't happened? Out of curiosity, I stared at the markings, just able to make them out, but there was no answer there. I remember thinking how pathetic they were, they having the ability to send me to any time, yet whoever or whatever invented them didn't bother to make them glow in the dark. It took me yet another hour to fully realise that nothing was going to happen, and by then I was feeling the cold. How nice it would be to just go home to my proper time, make a coffee in my parents' kitchen, and slip upstairs to watch TV in my room. But there was zero chance of that happening, because I felt sure that there was probably a small army of television companies parked outside, with all their cameras pointing at the house, hoping that my appearance. For the first time since this debacle began, I really didn't know what to do. In short, I felt helpless with a capital H. Remaining in 2026 was not a good idea, yet everything I knew was here. However, on the other hand, I could not stay forever next to that oak tree. It was all I could do to stare at those dark marks, hoping for an answer, or at least some inspiration. But nothing came, and the more I looked, the more nothing came. So you won't be surprised when I tell you that I became frustrated and then got angry, as I knew that my present predicament was all down to them. I remember my earlier thoughts about having them removed surgically, and I cursed myself for not having it done. And then, it was as if a light came on in my head. A singular idea so revolutionary, but dramatic and frightening that I felt nauseous. But how could it be done? Now, I've no doubt I might be the first to admit that I have a strong aversion to physical pain, but I'd certainly be up there in the top 10. And what I thought of scared me enough to make me numb. Because it was all about the marks, what they were, how they came to be there, and more importantly, how deep did they go in my skin? I had long ago given up trying to understand how they worked. Whatever technology created them was far in excess of anything I had been taught or even imagined, so I had given up even thinking about them in that way. I didn't even know if they could even be removed, or if they could, how would that affect me? Yet I was sure there was one way, as terrible as the thought that originated in my subconscious and now made its way into my consciousness. And this was to remove the hand. Yes, finally, I had openly admitted it to myself. Lose the hand and all my problems would disappear. In that single moment, a flash of inspiration, I knew that to be the answer. I was back in my correct time. There only seemed to be one of me, so all that remained was... But just how the bloody hell was I able to do that? With Mercury and Venus now lost under the horizon, and the constellation of Cassiopeia only having moved just a few degrees on its circumpolar route, I thought hard about the option. An option that was not agreeable at all. However, removing it with myself with some kind of sharp knife and a saw seemed the most stupidest idea, as I had no medical knowledge and no anaesthetic. Plus, the idea of causing so much damage to myself was just simply abhorrent. And what if I found the pain too much and I became unconscious, leaving my body to bleed out? Doing it alone would only mean one thing. Plus, I didn't know anything about tying off blood vessels or even the best place to cut. No. Think again. The idea of paying a surgeon privately to remove it wasn't such a far-fetched idea. After all, I had millions in the bank. Surely I could find a surgeon with low morals and a fondness for ready cash. But what put me off was that it would just all take time, and at the end of the day, could I trust him or her? Once under the anaesthetic, what's to prevent them from immediately turning me into the public, who could maul me and suffocate me to death? Or for the military to remove me to some secret facility where they would experiment on me? Yes, I've got a fevered imagination. I'm a mathematician at the top of my game, so it's my stock in trade to think of weird and wonderful solutions and scenarios. I suddenly had a picture in my mind, a memory about how thieves had their hands removed in ancient days. No, come on, John, be sensible. But it did make me think about how the thieves survived afterwards, most probably by cauterization, when perhaps the sword had been heated red hot. I shook my head rapidly. Stop thinking like that. But the surgeon idea was gaining the upper hand. Forgive the unintentional pun. Yes, perhaps a two-stage event, one where safety was assured and I got what I wanted. But the idea still wasn't attractive all the same, and it would definitely require a little courage. No more than a little, the more I thought about it. On the other hand, I could secretly speak to Maggie and ask her to use my credit card to get me some pure gold. Then I could leave my money to her, go to the 1930s, buy a house and live there peacefully and undisturbed until I died. Perhaps I could teach. I could employ a housekeeper and leave the place to Maggie and Zoe once they are born. Maggie and Zoe. Yeah, I would miss them. My sisters. I love them, really. It hurt to think of never seeing them again. And I suppose, begrudgingly, my parents. Or at least my mother. Suddenly the idea of living peacefully in the past lost its shine, which left me with one other option, and not one that I was looking forward to doing. I was aware of the Hainault industrial estate only because, as a younger man, I used to accompany my father when he went to visit his oldest friend from his university days, who then worked as a meteorologist at a laboratory. As the crow flies, it was only about 7.5 kilometres, but I never enjoyed the journey, spending that much time alone with him. However, I well remember the amount of heavy trucks that constantly entered and left the premises, presumably weighed down with metal. I still don't know what the place did with all that metal, as there was never a sign of a furnace or smoke or anything like that. But as with the way of youths, I didn't question it at the time. Something told me that the place where was a place where I could put in action my very, very, very stupid idea for ridding me of one of the marks. Of course, it being 2026, there was no way I was able to travel there without being recognised, so in a crazy use of the marks, I sent myself to 2016 and took the underground to Hainault and walked along New Road. Only when I was almost on top of the company did I return myself to the present of 2026. And the next day.
You have been listening to an audio production of The Luckiest Man in the World by Molly Cutpurse, narrated by John Crabtree PhD.